137. We've heard this many times as a scripture and in song. By the rivers of Babylon, there we sat down and there we wept when we remembered Zion. On the willows there we hung up our harps. For there our captors asked us for songs, and our tormentors asked us for mirth, saying, "Sing us one of the songs of Zion." How could we sing the Lord's song in a foreign land? Then one of the readings that cuts home, Lamentations 3 from verse 17. I gave up on life altogether. I've forgotten what the good life is like. I said to myself, this is it. I'm finished. God is a lost cause. I'll never forget the trouble, the utter lostness, the taste of ashes, the poison I've swallowed. I remember it all. Oh, how well I remember the feeling of hitting the bottom. In these readings, the cry goes out, why God? Why are all these bad things happening to us? Why have you abandoned us? Why do you not listen and answer? A cry of despair. I know that many of us have felt this way at times and still may be feeling it. As well, I think we as a congregation have felt it in recent times. But the answer is also there in the readings. I will continue in Lamentations. Chapter 3, verse 21. But there is one thing I remember, and remembering I keep a grip on hope. God's loyal love couldn't have run out. His merciful love couldn't have dried up. It's created new every morning. How great your faithfulness. I'm sticking with God. I say it over and over. I'm sticking with God. He's all I've got left. And from Habakkuk 2, God answered, write this, write what you see, write it out in big block letters so that it can be read on the run. This vision is a witness pointing to what's coming. It aches for the coming. It can hardly wait, and it doesn't lie. If it seems slow in coming, wait. It's on the way. It will come right on time. So as I see it, the answer is, hang in there, be patient, trust God, wait on him, and at the right time, his answer will be clear. The reflection in the newsletter this week includes these words. Sometimes it takes as much courage to wait upon God as it does to act in his name. As we wait before the Lord in worship, and as we walk with him daily, he puts his strength in our hearts. And quoting from Isaiah, but they who wait for the Lord shall renew their strength. They shall mount up with wings like eagles. They shall run and not be weary. They shall walk and not faint. The Israelites had to wait hundreds of years for their answer. How long will I wait? How long will you wait? How long will we all wait? Then the New Testament readings, which Cara read, are about having faith. I struggled with these. About the Luke passage, many commentators have said that Jesus is showing some humour here by creating an absurd image. Bruce Brewer, whose sermons I looked at, even titles his sermon on this passage, Call in the Clowns. I'll read the section just before today's passage in Luke to put it in context. Jesus is saying some hard things, and his disciples feel that they need more faith to be able to follow him. So Luke 17 from 1 in the Message. He said to his disciples, hard trials and temptations are bound to come, but too bad for whoever brings them on. Better to wear a millstone necklace and take a swim in the deep blue sea than give even one of these dear little ones a hard time. Be alert. If you see your friend going wrong, correct him. If he responds, forgive him. Even if it's personal against you and repeated 7 times through the day, and 7 times he says, I'm sorry, I won't do it again. Forgive him. Then the apostles came up and said to the Master, Lord, give us more faith. But the Master said, you don't need more faith. There is no more or less in faith. If you have a bare kernel of faith, say the size of a poppy seed, you could say to this sycamore tree, go jump in the lake, and it would do it. And I'm reading from Prua now. Planting trees in the sea sounds a clownish exercise. It even outdoes ludicrous. I reckon that's exactly what Jesus meant it to sound like. We miss the point in this mini parable if we look at it with solemn eyes. It's a cartoon he's creating. Think of it in cartoon terms. Unfetter your imagination. Imagine a bloke standing up to his waist in the sea at Manly, trying to plant a tree. Crazy? Yeah. But like any clever cartoon, behind this picture there's a serious point. In this cartoon, Jesus is challenging those who would follow him to start attempting the hard and clownish things. Such teaching of Christ is, for many, impractical nonsense, but not for the disciples. For the disciples, it is the way to go. Faith is not having a lever to get God to do what we want, but the readiness of us to do what God wants. Even a little faith, Jesus says, even faith as small as a mustard seed, will have surprising results. And reading again from 2 Timothy 1, from verse 8, this time in the Message. So don't be embarrassed to speak up for our Master or for me, his prisoner. Take your share of suffering for the message along with the rest of us. We can only keep going, after all, by the power of God, who first saved us and then called us to this holy work. We had nothing to do with it. It was all his idea, a gift prepared for us in Jesus long before we knew anything about it. So I see the message for us from the lectionary readings as, even in your despair, hang in there, be patient, trust God, wait on him, have faith. But be clear, your faith is a gift from God, not something you have to earn. Last time in my song, My Story, I finished with some spiritual highlights from our time in Broken Hill, where I was lecturing mathematics at a small University of New South Wales college. Now I want to concentrate on some of the times that we felt despair and when we questioned God's wisdom. I think my family became a bit complacent in the early 80s. This is some time ago, you see. All was going well in Broken Hill. We'd just come back from our wonderful year in Cambridge. Then came what seemed to us a time of disaster. Firstly, UNSW decided to close the Broken Hill campus and transfer us to Sydney. As an aside, I'd been the local University Staff Association union rep for many years before I went to Cambridge and passed it on to somebody else, but was very glad somebody else was looking after the negotiations at this time. None of my family wanted to move to a big city, particularly Sydney, as we'd all adapted to the country life and our kids had grown up knowing nothing else. So I applied for many other lecturing jobs in smaller places, had some very near successes, but nothing came of it. Eventually, we reluctantly accepted that we had no choice but to move to Sydney and so we started planning for the move. But we still cried out, God, why? While we were in Broken Hill, Ray had applied for permanent casual teaching work. But as she was only infant trained, she was given a job back in an infant school. She didn't enjoy it, but we needed the money to move to Sydney, so she stuck with it. And then our second disaster struck. Ray slipped at the top of some wet steps at the school and slid down a whole flight of steps, seriously injuring her coccyx and lower back. It seemed like the end of the world as she suddenly became significantly disabled and could not sit or stand for any length of time and had limited mobility. In fact, we carted a beanbag around in the car everywhere we went so that she could have some comfort in sitting. Some of you who visited our house may still remember in the early 2000s, one that was sitting there in the lounge. Where was God in all of this? Why was there seeming all these disasters and disappointments? Why was everything bad happening? We hung in there, trusting that God would make something out of the mess that we were in. And answers eventually came, but we had to wait the best part of 3 years before we started seeing where we were being led. As part of the deal the union negotiated with the university, the uni gave us a fully paid fortnight in Sydney to find a house to buy. How much time people spend these days. And they would load us the money at up to a certain value at low interest. We flew to Sydney to term break and started searching out at Kensington near the university. Then further out we moved, and further, and further, and further, until we ended up looking at dozens of houses in the Bangor-Menai area, all with no luck. Some Christian friends that we had made in Cambridge, surprise, surprise, introduced us to a real estate agent called Bob. He turned out to be a beach mission leader and active in the Anglican Church and later on in the Pentecostal Church. He was actually building a house at Bangor, so he knew the area quite well. He and his family later became great friends. So on our second week looking for a house, Bob took us to a place we had seen listed, one we liked on paper, but was out of our range, so we hadn't actually even looked at it. But the price he'd been given was lower, so we went with him to see it. Staggeringly, before Ray and I had reached the front door up the steep drive, we both felt that it was the right home for us. And after inspecting it, we knew it was right. Then, more bitter disappointment. The price Bob had been given was wrong. The unattainable price was the correct price. We, however, were convinced that it was right, and so we had a desperate few days trying to organise some finance. The bank of Mum and Dad came good and paid the deposit for us. So we headed back to Broken Hill, having bought a new house in less than 2 weeks. We still couldn't afford it, but trusted that God would provide. And without Bob being given the wrong price, none of this would have never happened. Again, God had a hand in the outcome. And remember, this is all while Ray could hardly sit or stand, so we were carting numerous cushions on the plane and in the car. Ray visited many specialists about her back, but was eventually deemed by the department doctors permanently unable to work. We know how that ended up. And she was given a small payout by the Education Department's workers' comp. We used some of that to buy the yellow 8-seat Star Wagon people mover that some of you will remember us driving. The upright seating in it meant that Ray could sit or drive with some comfort, and we knew that it would suit us. And the rest of the payout helped us afford the house. We had no trouble selling our house in Broken Hill, but of course at the Broken Hill going price. The Sydney one was more than 3 times the price that we got for the house in Broken Hill. When we finally moved in 1984, we drove the yellow brick, which we called it, to Sydney and slept overnight on the way. There we were in the car with lots of luggage and plants, Ray and I, the 2 kids, and the cocky Molly who had adopted us a couple of years earlier. It's hard to imagine the pain Ray suffered on that trip. Bob's family were on a beach mission when we arrived in Sydney, so they let us stay in their house. We'd only met his wife once. Our furniture arrived and we got everything sorted and moved in. I quickly settled into the daily grind of a long car commute in heavy traffic from Bangor to Kensington. If Ray needed the car, I got a lift or rode my motorbike to Sutherland and then took the train, then bus to work. I wasn't game to ride the motorbike any further in Sydney. We still hadn't arranged which school the kids would go to. There was no close local public high school, and they would have to be bused to some schools whose reputation we had heard was not good. So we applied for entry into Innerborough High School, which was a small Baptist private school, just 5 minutes walk from our house, perhaps a bit like Toongabbie Christian School. Bob's kids were attending there, and we knew that it had a good reputation. They were just starting up and only had students to year 10, but there weren't any positions free for my kids, and they told us that very firmly. Then the day before we were to buy uniforms for the state school, and less than a week before school started, we got that lovely phone call. Your son has a place. Somebody's dropped out of year 9. And then because of their sibling rules, my youngest in year 8 was also accepted. This ended up being an ideal school for the kids, and they made many lifelong friends there. God works in mysterious ways, but sometimes I wish he wouldn't leave it till the last minute. In Bangor, we attended the Menai Uniting Church, which effectively was a little country church being overrun by suburbia. Ray was still on a beanbag at the morning service. The congregation was about a dozen, and the kids found no other young people their age. So in the evenings, we attended the Sutherland Church, which is in the same multi-church parish. They had a lively service, lots of youth, and a band that my daughter played in. To give you an idea, it was much bigger than Night Rocks at its peak. We regularly took a full Star Wagon full of our kids' friends to church and later to youth groups, confirming that vehicle's usefulness and God's provision in all sorts of weird ways. Then, about a year later, the parish asked Ray if she would become an elder. That sounds okay, but it was a complete bolt out of the blue. In Broken Hill, she had come under the influence of a group of women who thought that women should not hold any place of leadership within the church. Ray took that to extremes and interpreted it quite strictly as being not including being an elder either. As an aside, I never understood how she ever came to that view. After some consideration and trusting the Lord, she made a deal with him. Okay, if you want me to be an elder, you'll have to change my understanding on women's roles and also heal me. And the Lord answered Ray quite emphatically. Within a short time, her back improved enough for her to be able to get around, and even more miraculously, her attitude changed, and so she accepted the nomination. But Ray couldn't leave it there. She wanted to go further and get some training for the role. So she decided to go to Bible school to help her with the eldership. She looked at every Bible school in Sydney and online with the attitude that I well remember her saying, "Lord, anywhere but UTC." She should have learnt already that you don't say that sort of thing to God. Just like we'd already learnt when we'd said, "Anywhere but Sydney." So many doors closed and opened under the Lord's control, so that she ended up at UTC as a fee-paying private student. After one term there, her fellow students and the staff encouraged her to consider candidating as a minister. This radical thought would have never occurred to her a year earlier, and she still resisted the thought. As this would affect me and my position and our kids, we together sought God's will on it and struggled a lot with what it would mean for the whole family. Then another miracle. I well remembered being at a healing service in Sutherland and going forward for a prayer. A complete stranger who did not know me or our situation prophesied over me that the Lord was calling us to something new and to not resist the call. Ray too felt the same call at the same service, and within a day the decision was made that she would apply to be a candidate for ministry. A weight was lifted, so in term 2, 1987, Ray candidated. It was a little awkward, as by then I was chair of the Sutherland Parish Council, which had to approve this. Of course, protocol was followed, and I absented myself from all the discussions. The Parish Council and Presbytery soon unanimously approved, and Ray became a candidate. It's only in hindsight that you can see how the Lord leads you through all the disappointments and the despair to where he wants you. So that is my story part. Where on earth does the song come from? Well, in all this despair and finding God's answers, we learnt that by praising God, we came near to him and were able to trust him. We were discovering the praise songs of the 1980s, and the one that stands out the most for me is not a song, it's a full album. It's We Are Called, an experience of worship by Steve Fry. To understand the impact of this, you really need to hear the whole album played in order. But I've searched online and I cannot find a link to the whole album. We used to play this record at full volume in our lounge at Bangor. We had no near neighbours. Long story. And elsewhere, at the manse at Dundas. And I still listen to it regularly at very high volume on rotation when I'm touring in my van. From that album, I think one of the most worshipful songs is the one we will now hear but not stand and sing, and through it worship God. It's called Abba Father. Amen.